Hey guys, welcome to GameLifeStory. It's just been a weird night. I didn't enjoy Roller Coaster Tycoon very much till the very end, and then that was only because I thought I knew what was going on and I didn't. Obviously Rocket League didn't go well, but that's okay, that happens sometimes. And I'm just tired, but yeah, you're right, I do want to read. I have been enjoying the story and I want to keep it up, so I don't want to leave you guys hanging on that. Story time's the best. Story time is everything. When I'm an 80-year-old streamer, it's probably all I'll still have to do. So, let's get my screen set up over here. Oop. Take a little sip. And let's get a little bit of Pawn of the Prophecy. Tonight, we begin with Chapter 11. Last night, that is the theory, Moose. That is the theory. Yeah, so if you guys haven't voted in the RPG poll or the action poll, or even if you have, I should say, voted in the RPG or action poll, the polls that are up now are new. In fact, before I start the stream, let me reword them so that that is clearer. Guess I want to update that. Splinter Cell or Rock. Let's make this a thing so I can do this too. Still hoping for Tom Clancy. Thanks, Moose. For those of you who haven't voted in the finals yet, here's the RPG poll. It's between Ravenloft and Daggerfall. And here is the action poll. Finals between Splinter Cell and Turok. So please vote if you haven't. So you let me know what the hell I'm doing next week. And that is that. Yeah, so like I said, hopefully the wife and I are going to the Monmouth County Fair tomorrow. But it's supposed to be rain all day and thunder showers and that kind of thing, so unless we get lucky weather-wise, excuse me. If we get lucky weather-wise, I'll be going to the fair. But if the weather is as expected, I will be streaming at some point. I just don't know what or when. But then Sunday stream should be normal. Unless we trade tomorrow for Sunday. I'm not sure. I'll let you know tomorrow probably. But in any case, thanks for hanging out. Tonight we are here for a little bit of Pawn of the Prophecy by David Eddings. GameLifeStory continues with Chapter 11. They were 9 days on the coast road from Kmar to the capital at Sendar. Oh, and last night what happened was they got really close to what they were chasing, whatever that may be. when Captain Brendig pulled out Lady Paul on her bluff of being the Duchess of Erat, and insisted that she and her party accompany him to see the King of Sendar, because he had been sent looking for the old wolf, Mr. Wolf, so to speak, or a man by his description in any case. And for whatever reason, Wolf agreed, rather than telling the dude to screw off or giving him problems. They agreed to go see the King of Sendar, so that's where we pick up. So there were 9 days on the coast road from Kamar to the capital at Sendar that was only 55 leagues. Captain Brandig measured their pace carefully, and the detachment of soldiers was arranged in such fashion that even the thought of escape was impossible. Although it had stopped snowing, the road was still difficult, and the wind which blew in off the sea and across the broad, snow-covered salt marshes was raw and chill. They stayed each night in the evenly spaced Sendarian hostels, which stood like mileposts along the uninhabited stretch of coast. The hostels were not quite so well appointed as were their Tondetran counterparts along the Great North Road, but they were at least adequate. Captain Brendig seemed solicitous about their comfort, but he also posted guards each night. On the evening of the second day, Garion sat near the fire with Dernick, staring moodily into the flames. Dernick was his oldest friend, and Garion felt a desperate need for friendship just then. "Dernick," he said finally. "Yes, lad." "Have you ever been in a dungeon?" "Now what could I have done to be put in a dungeon?" "I thought that you might have seen one sometime." "Honest folk don't go near such places," Dernick said. "I heard they're awful, dark and cold and full of rats." "What's this talk of dungeons?" Dernick asked. "I'm afraid we may find out all about places like that very soon," Garion said, trying not to sound too frightened. "We've done nothing wrong," Dernick said. I don't know why he's turning Irish all of a sudden. "Then why would the king have a siege like this? Kings don't do things like that without good reason." "We haven't done anything wrong," Dernick repeated stubbornly. "But maybe Mr. Wolf has," Garion suggested. "The king wouldn't send all these soldiers after him without some reason. And we could all be thrown in the dungeon with him just because we happened to be his companions." "Things like that don't happen in Sandaria," Dernick said firmly. Points toward the local bakery. Nice. The next day the wind was very strong as it blew in off the sea, but it was a warm wind, and the foot-deep snow on the road began to turn slushy. By midday it had started to rain. They rode in sodden misery toward the next hostel. "I'm afraid we'll have to delay our journey until this blows out," Captain Brendig said that evening, looking out one of the tiny windows of the hostel. "The road's going to be quite impassable by morning." They spent the next day and the next, sitting in the cramped main room of the hostel, listening to the wind-driven rain slashing at the walls and roof. All the while, under watchful eyes of Brendig and his soldiers. "Silk," said Garion on the second day, moving over to the bench where the rat-faced little man sat dozing. "Yes, Garion," Silk said, rousing himself. "What kind of man is the king?" "Which king?" "Of Sandaria." "A foolish man, like all kings," Silk laughed. "The Sandarian kings are perhaps a bit more foolish, but that's only natural. Why do you ask?" "Hey, delve." "Well," Garion hesitated, "let's suppose that somebody did something the king didn't like, and there were some other people traveling with him, and the king had these people seized. Would the king just throw them all into the dungeon, or would he let the others go and just keep the one who'd angered him?" Silk looked at him for a moment and then spoke firmly. "That question is unworthy of you, Garion." Garion flushed. "I'm afraid of dungeons," he said in a small voice, suddenly very ashamed of himself. "I don't want to be locked up in the dark forever when I don't even know what for." "The kings of Sandaria are just and honest men," Silk told him. "Not too bright, I'm afraid, but always fair." "How can they be kings if they aren't wise?" Garion objected. "Wisdom's a useful trait in a king," Silk said, "but hardly essential." "How do they get to be kings, then?" Garion demanded. "Some are born to it," Silk said. "The stupidest man in the world can be a king if he has the right parents. Sandarian kings have a disadvantage because they started so low." "Low?" "They were elected. Nobody ever elected a king before, only the Sendars." "That's alright, I can't speak tonight, Moose. Dr. Madnar, it's all good. I saw the M and I thought it was Moose." They were elected. Nobody ever elected a king before, only the Sandars. How do you elect a king? Silk smiled. Very badly, Garion. It's a poor way to select a king. The other ways are worse, but election is a very bad way to choose a king. Tell me how it was done, Garion said. Silk glanced briefly at the rain-spattered window across the room and shrugged. It's a way to pass the time, he said, and then he leaned back, stretched his feet toward the fire, and began. The boy wants to know, Captain... Oh, I think I skipped a page. Yep, I skipped a page. Oh, nobody cared. Everybody doing other things, dude. They just listening. It all started about 15 years ago, he said, his voice loud enough to reach the ears of Captain Brendig, who sat nearby writing on a piece of parchment. Sandaria wasn't a kingdom then, or even a separate country. It had belonged from time to Cherrick, Algaria, or the Northern Arons, Wassite, or Astorian, depending on the fortunes of the Orangish Civil War. When that war finally came to an end, and the Wassites were destroyed, and the Astorians had been defeated and driven into the untracked reaches of the Great Forest in northern Erendia, the Emperor of Talnedra, Ranhorv II, decided that there ought to be a kingdom here. It was last night. I left it on tonight. Nobody delved all night tonight or last night, so... Whatever you guys want to do. I'm inconsistent, Jaredin. I'm old and I forget things. How could the Talnedran Emperor make that kind of decision for Sandaria? Garion asked. The arm of the Empire is very long, Silk said. The Great North Road had been built during the Second Baroon dynasty. I think it was Ranbaroon IV who started the construction, wasn't it, Captain? The Fifth, Brendig said somewhat sourly without looking up. Ranbaroon V. Thank you, Captain, Silk said. I can never keep the Baroon dynasty straight. Anyway, there was already Imperial legions in Sandaria to maintain the highway. And if one has troops in an area, one has a certain authority. Wouldn't you say, Captain? It's your story. Indeed it is. Now, if it wasn't really out of any kind of generosity that Ranhorb made his decision, Garion, don't misunderstand that. Talnedrans never give anything away. It was just that the Mimbrae Arens had finally won the Orangish Civil War, 1,000 years of bloodshed and treachery, and Talnedra couldn't afford to allow the Mimbraids to expand into the north. The creation of an independent kingdom in Sandaria would block Mimbraid access to the trade routes down out of Drasnia, and prevent the seat of the world power from moving to full Mimbrae and leaving the imperial capital at Talhaneth in a kind of backwater. It all sounds terribly involved, Garion said. Not really, Silk said. It's only politics, and that's a very simple game, isn't it, Captain? A game I do not play, Brendig said, not looking up. Really, Silk said. So long at court, and you're not a politician. You're a rare man, Captain. At any rate, the Sandars suddenly discovered that they had themselves a kingdom, but that they had no genuine hereditary nobility. Oh, there were a few retired Talnedran nobles living on the estates here and there, sordid pretenders to this or that Wassite or Astorian title, a Cherrick war chief or two, with a few fellow followers, but no genuine Sandarian nobility. Nobility? Making up words. And so it was that they decided to hold a national election, select a king, don't you see, and then leave the bestowing of titles up to him. A very practical approach, and typically Sandarian. How do you elect a king? Garion asked, beginning to lose his thread of dungeons and his fascination with the story. Everybody votes, Silk said simply. Parents, of course, probably cast the votes for their children, but it appears that there was very little cheating. The rest of the world stood around and laughed at all this foolishness, but the Sandars continued to cast ballot after ballot for a dozen years. 6 years, actually, Brendig said, with his face still down over his parchment. 3827 to 3833. And there were over 1,000 candidates, Silk said expansively. 743, Brendig said tightly. I stand corrected, noble captain. It's an enormous comfort to have such an expert here to catch my errors. I'm but a simple Drasnian merchant with little background in history. Anyway, on the 23rd ballot, they finally erected their king, a rutabaga farmer named Fundor. He raised more than just rutabagas, Brendig said, looking up with an angry face. Of course he did, Silk said, smacking his forehead with an open palm. How could I have forgotten the cabbages? He raised cabbages too, Garion. Never forget the cabbages. Well, everybody in Sandaria, who thought he was important, journeyed to Fundor's farm and found him vigorously fertilizing his fields, and they greeted him with a great cry, Hail Fundor, the Magnificent, King of Sandaria, and fell on his knees in their august presence. In his august presence. What is wrong with me? Somebody shoot me in the face now. No? Then I'll go on. Must we continue with this? Brendig asked, a pained voice looking up. The boy wants to know, Captain, Silk replied with an innocent face. It's our duty as his elders to instruct him in the history of our past, wouldn't you say? Say whatever you like, Brendig said in a stiff voice. Thank you for your permission, Captain, Silk said, inclining his head. Do you know what the King of Sandaria said then, Garion? He asked. No? What? I pray you, your eminences, the king said, have a care for your finery. I have just as well manured the bed in which you were kneeling. I guess you'll have to do what? Shoot me in the head? What the hell? Barak, who was sitting nearby, roared with laughter, pounding his knee with one huge hand. What's happening? I'm confused. Barak, who was sitting nearby, roared with laughter, pounding his knee with one huge hand. I find this less than amusing, sir, Captain Brendig said coldly, rising to his feet. I make no jokes about the King of Drasnia, do I? You're a courteous man, Captain, Silk said mildly, and a nobleman. I'm merely a poor man, trying to make his way in the world. Brendig looked at him helplessly, and then turned and stamped from the room. The following morning, the wind had blown itself out and the rain had stopped. The road was very nearly a quagmire, but Brendig decided that they must continue. Travel that day was difficult, but the next was somewhat easier as the road began to drain. Aunt Poll seemed unconcerned by the fact that they had been seized at the king's orders. She maintained her regal bearing, even though Garion saw no real need to continue the subterfuge, and wished fervently that she would abandon it. The familiar practical sensibility with which she had ruled her kitchen and Faldor's farm had somehow been replaced by a kind of demanding willfulness that Garion found particularly distressing. For the first time in his life, he felt a distance between them. There had left a vacancy that had never been there before. To make matters worse, the gnawing uncertainty which had been steadily growing since Silk's unequivocal declaration on the hilltop outside Winold, that Aunt Poll could not possibly be his aunt, sawed roughly at his sense of his own identity, and Garion often found himself staring at the awful question, Who am I? Mr. Wolf seemed to change as well. He seldom spoke, either on the road nor at night in the hostels. He spent a great deal of time sitting by himself with an expression of moody irritability on his face. Finally, on the 9th day after their departure from Kamar, the broad salt marshes ended and the land about the coast became more rolling. They topped a hill about midday just as the pale winter sun broke through the clouds, and there in the valley below them, the walled city of Sendar lay facing the sea. The detachment of guards at the south gate of the city saluted smartly as Captain Brendig led the little party through, and he returned their salute crisply. The broad streets of the city seemed filled with people in their finest clothing, all moving about importantly, as if their errands were the most vital in the world. Courtiers, Barak, who chanced to be riding beside Garion, snorted with contempt. Not a real man among them. Unnecessary evil, my dear Barak, Silk said back over his shoulder to the big man. Little jobs require little men, and it's the little jobs that keep a kingdom running. After they had passed through a magnificently large square, they yawned, and then they moved up a wide avenue to the palace. It was a very large building with many stories and broad wings extending out to each side of the paved courtyard. The entire structure was surrounded by a round tower that was easily the highest edifice in the whole city. Where do you suppose the dungeons are? Garion whispered to Dernick when they stopped. I would take it most kindly, Garion, Dernick said with a pained look, if you would not speak so much of dungeons. Captain Brendig dismounted and went to meet a fussy-looking man in an embroidered tunic and a feathered cap, who came down the wide steps at the front of the palace to meet them. They spoke for a few moments and seemed to be arguing. My orders are from the king himself, Brendig said, his voice carrying to where they sat. I am commanded to deliver these people directly to him immediately upon our arrival. My orders are also from the king, the fussy-looking man said, and I am commanded to have them made presentable before they are delivered to the throne room. I will take charge of them. They will remain in my custody, Count Nilden, until they have been delivered to the king himself, Brendig said coldly. I will not have your muddy soldiers tracking through the halls of the palace, Lord Brendig, the count replied. And we will wait here, Count Nilden, Brendig said. Be so good as to fetch his majesty. Fetch? The count's face was aghast. I am chief butler to his majesty's household, Lord Brendig. I do not fetch anything or anyone. Brendig turned as if to remount his horse. Oh, very well, Count Nilden said petulantly. If you must have it your way, at least have them wipe their feet. Brendig bowed coldly. I won't forget this, Lord Brendig, Nilden threatened. Nor shall I, Count Nilden, Brendig replied. Then they all dismounted, and with Brendig's soldiers drawn up in close order about them, they crossed the courtyard to a broad door near the center of the west wing. Be so good as to follow me, Count Nilden said, glancing with a shudder at the mud-spattered soldiers as he led them into the wide corridor which lay beyond the door. Apprehension and curiosity struggled in Garion's mind. Despite the assurances of Silk and Dernick and the hopeful implications of Count Nilden's announcement that he was going to have them made presentable, the threat of some clammy rat-infested dungeon, complete with a rack and a wheel, and other unpleasant things, still seemed very real. On the other hand, he had never been in a palace before, and his eyes tried to be everywhere at once. That part of his mind... Cut it out! When it comes all at once, guys. That part of his mind which sometimes spoke to him in a dry detachment told him that his fears were probably groundless, and that his gawking made him appear to be a dotish country bumpkin. Count Nilden led them directly to a part of the corridor, where there were a number of highly polished doors. This one is for the boy, he announced, pointing at one of them. One of the soldiers opened the door, and Garion reluctantly stepped through, looking back over his shoulder at Aunt Poll. Come along now, a somewhat impatient voice said. Garion whirled, not knowing what to expect. Close the door, boy, a fine-looking man who had been waiting for him said. We don't have all day. No. The man was waiting beside a large wooden tub with steam rising from it. Quickly, boy, take off those filthy rags and get in the tub. His Majesty is waiting. Too confused to object or even answer, Garion numbly began to unlace his tunic. After he had bathed and had the knots had been brushed out of his hair, he was dressed in clothes which lay on a nearby bench. His coarse woolen hose of serviceable peasant brown were exchanged for ones of much finer weave, in a lustrous blue. His scuffed and muddy boots were traded for soft leather shoes. His tunic was soft white linen, and the doublet he wore over it was rich blue, trimmed with a silvery fur. I guess that's the best I can do on short notice, the man who had bathed and dressed him said, looking him up and down critically. At least I won't be totally embarrassed when you're presented to the king. Oh, yeah. This is why I read myself to sleep, guys. Garion mumbled his thanks, and then stood, waiting for further instructions. Well, go along, boy. You mustn't keep His Majesty waiting. Silk and Barrack stood in the corridor, talking quietly. Barrack was hugely splendid in a green brocade doublet, but looked uncomfortable without his sword. Silk's doublet was a rich black, trimmed in silver, and his scraggly whiskers had been carefully trimmed into an elegant short beard. What does all of this mean? Garion asked as he joined them. We're to be presented to the king, Barrack said, and our honest clothes might have given offense. Kings aren't accustomed to looking at ordinary men. Dernick emerged from one of the rooms, his face pale with anger. That overdressed fool wanted to give me a bath, he said in a choked outrage. It is the custom, Silk explained. Noble guests aren't expected to bathe themselves. I hope you didn't hurt him. I'm not a noble, and I'm quite able to bathe myself, Dernick said hotly. I told him that I'd drown him in his own tub if he didn't keep his hands to himself. After that, he didn't pester me anymore, but he did steal my clothes. I had to put these on instead. He gestured at his clothes, which were quite similar to Garion's. I hope nobody sees me in all this frippery. Barrack says the king might be offended if he saw us in our real clothes, Garion told him. The king won't be looking at me, Dernick said, and I don't like this business of trying to look like something I'm not. I'll wait outside with the horses if I can get my own clothes back. Be patient, Dernick, Barrack advised. We'll get this business with the king straightened out, and then be on our way again. If Dernick was angry, Mr. Wolf was in what could best be described as a towering fury. He came out into the corridor dressed in a snowy white robe, deeply cowled at his back. Someone is going to pay for this, he raged. It does become you, Silk said admiringly. Your taste has always been questionable, Master Silk, Wolf said in a frosty tone. Where's Poll? The lady has not yet made her appearance, Silk said. I should have known, Wolf said, sitting down on a nearby bench. We may as well be comfortable. Poll's preparations usually take quite a while. And so they waited. Captain Brendig, who had changed his boots and doublet, paced up and down as the minutes dragged by. Garion was totally baffled by their reception. They did not seem to be under arrest, but his imagination still saw dungeons, and that was enough to make him very jumpy. And then Aunt Poll appeared. She wore the blue velvet gown that had been made for her in Kamar, and a silver circlet about her head, which set off the single white lock at her brow. Her bearing was regal and her face stern. So soon, Mistress Poll? Wolf asked dryly. I hope you weren't rushed. She ignored that and examined each of them in turn. Adequate, I suppose, she said finally, absently adjusting the collar of Garion's doublet. Give me your arm, old wolf, and let's find out what the king of the Centaurs wants with us. Mr. Wolf rose from his bench, extended his arm, and the two of them started down the corridor. Captain Brendig hastily assembled his soldiers and followed them all in some kind of ragged order. If you please, my lady, he called out to Aunt Poll, permit me to show you the way. We know the way, Lord Brendig, she replied, without so much as turning her head. Count Nildon, the chief butler, stood waiting for them in front of two massive doors, guarded by uniformed men-at-arms. He bowed slightly to Aunt Poll, and snapped his fingers. He could swap his fingers, that would be something else. The men-at-arms swung the heavy doors inward. Ulrak, the king of Sandaria, was a dumpy-looking man with short brown beard. He sat rather uncomfortably, it appeared, on a high-backed throne which stood on a dais at one end of the great hall into which Count Nildon led them. The throne room was vast, with a high-vaulted ceiling and walls covered with what seemed acres of heavy red velvet drapery. There were candles everywhere, and dozens of people strolled about in fine clothes, and chatted idly in corners, all but ignoring the presence of the king. May I announce you? Count Nildon asked Mr. Wolf. Ulrak knows who I am, Wolf replied shortly, and strode down the long scarlet carpet toward the throne, with Aunt Poll still on his arm. Garion and the others followed, with Brendig and his soldiers close behind, through the suddenly quiet crowd of courtiers and their ladies. At the foot of the throne they all stopped, and Wolf bowed rather coldly. Aunt Poll, her eyes frosty, curtsied, and Barrack and Silk bowed in a courtly manner. Dernick and Garion followed suit, though not nearly as gracefully. If it please your majesty, Brendig's voice came from behind them, these are the ones you sought. I knew you could be depended on, Lord Brendig, the king replied in a rather ordinary-sounding voice. Your reputation is well deserved. You have my thanks. Then he looked at Mr. Wolf and at the rest of them, his expression undecipherable. Garion began to tremble. Thank you, Vane. My dear old friend, the king said to Mr. Wolf, it's been too many years since we met last. Have you lost your wits entirely, Fulrak? Mr. Wolf snapped in the voice which carried no further than the king's ears. Why do you choose to interfere with me now of all times? And what possessed you to outfit me in this absurd thing? He plucked at the front of his white robe in every disgust. Are you trying to announce my presence to every Murgo from here to the Book of Erendia? Book of Erendia? Arr. The king's face looked pained. I was afraid you might take it that way, he said in a voice no louder than Mr. Wolf's had been. I'll explain when we can speak more privately. He turned quickly to Aunt Poll as if trying to preserve the appearance of at least dignity. It has been much too long since we have seen you, dear lady. Layla and the children have missed you, and I have been desolate in your absence. Your Majesty is too kind, Aunt Poll said, her tone as cold as Wolf's. The king winced. Pray, dear lady, he apologized, don't judge me too hastily. My reasons were urgent. I hope that Lord Brendig's summons did not too greatly inconvenience you. Lord Brendig was the soul of courtesy, Aunt Poll said, her tone unchanged. She glanced once at Brendig, who had grown visibly pale. And you, my Lord Barrack, the king hurried, as if trying to make the best of a bad situation. How fares your cousin, our dear brother king, Angheg of Cherrick? He was well when last I saw him, your majesty, Barrack replied formally. A bit drunk, but that's not unusual for Angheg. The king chuckled a bit nervously and turned quickly to Soak. Prince Keldar, of the royal house of Drasnia, he said, we are amazed to find such noble visitors in our realm, and more than a little injured that they chose not to call upon us, so that we might greet them. Is the king of the Centaurs of so little note that he's not even worth a brief stop? We intended no disrespect, your majesty, Soak replied, bowing, but our errand was of such urgency that there was no time for the usual courtesies. The king flickered a warning glance at that, and surprisingly wove his fingers in the scarcely perceptible gestures of the Drasnian secret language. Not here, too many ears about. He then looked inquiringly at Dernick and Garion. And Paul stepped forward. This is Goodman Dernick of the district of Erat, your majesty. A brave and honest man. Welcome, Goodman Dernick, the king said. I can only hope that men may also one day call me a brave and honest man. Dernick bowed awkwardly, his face filled with bewilderment. I'm just a simple blacksmith, your honor, he said, but I hope all men know that I am your honor's most loyal and devoted subject. Well spoken, Goodman Dernick, the king said with a smile, and then he looked at Garion. Aunt Poll followed his gaze. A boy, your majesty, she said rather indifferently. Garion by name. He was placed in my care some years ago and accompanies us because I didn't know what else to do with him. A terrible coldness struck at Garion's stomach. The certainty that her casual words were in fact the bald truth came crashing down upon him. She had not even tried to soften the blow. The indifference with which she had destroyed his life hurt almost more than the destruction itself. Also welcome, Garion, the king said. You travel in noble company for one so young. I didn't know who they were, your majesty, Garion said miserably. Nobody tells me anything. The king laughed in tolerant amusement. As you grow older, Garion, he said, you'll probably find that during these days such innocence is the most comfortable state in which to live. I've been told things of late that I'd much prefer not to know. May we speak privately now, Fulrak, Mr. Wolf said to his friend, his voice to the king, his voice still irritated. I don't know why I can't read anymore. In good time, my old friend, the king replied. I've ordered a banquet prepared in your honor. Let's all go in and dine. Layla and the children are waiting for us. There will be time later to discuss certain matters. And with that he rose and stepped down from the dais. Garion, sunk in his private misery, fell in beside Soak. Prince Keldar, he said, desperately needing to take his mind off the shocking reality that had just fallen upon him. An accident of birth, Garion, Soak said with a shrug. Something over which I had no control. Fortunately, I'm only the nephew of the King of Drasnia and far down in the line of succession. I'm not in any immediate danger of ascending the throne. And Barrack is the cousin of Kin Anhag of Cherrick, Soak replied. He looked over his shoulder. What is your exact rank, Barrack? He asked. The Earl of Trellheim, Barrack rumbled. Why do you ask? The lad here was curious. It's all nonsense anyway, Barrack said. But when Anhag became Someone had to become clan chief. In Sherrick, you can't be both. It's considered unlucky, particularly by the chiefs of the other clans. He's going to be glazed. Indeed. I can see why they might feel that way, Silk laughed. It's an empty title anyway, Barrack observed. There hasn't been a clan war in Sherrick for over 3,000 years. I let my youngest brother act in my stead. He's a simple-minded fellow and easily amused. Besides, it annoys my wife. You're married? Garion was startled. If you want to call it that, Barrack said sourly. Silk nudged Garion warningly, indicating that this was a delicate subject. Why didn't you tell us? Garion demanded accusingly. About your titles, I mean. Would it have made any difference? Silk asked. Well, no, Garion admitted. But he stopped, unable to put his feelings about the matter into words. I don't understand any of this, he concluded lamely. It will all become clear in time, Silk assured him as they entered the banquet hall. The hall was almost as large as the throne room. There were long tables covered with fine linen cloth, and once again candles everywhere. A servant stood behind each chair, and everything was supervised by a plump little woman with a beaming face and a tiny crown, perched precariously atop her head. As they all entered, she came forward quickly. "Dear Paul," she said, "you look just wonderful." She embraced Aunt Paul warmly, and the two began talking together animatedly. Queen Layla, Silk explained briefly to Garion. They call her the Mother of Sandaria. The 4 children over there are hers. She has 4 or 5 others, older and probably away on state business, since Fulrak insists that his children earn their keep. It's a standard joke among the other kings that Queen Layla's been pregnant since she was 14, but that's probably because they're expected to send royal gifts at each new birth. She's a good woman, though, and she keeps King Fulrak from making too many mistakes. She knows Aunt Paul, Garion said, and the fact disturbed him for some reason. Everybody knows your Aunt Paul, Silk told him. Since Aunt Paul and the Queen were in deep conversation and already drifting toward the head of the table, Garion stayed close to Silk. Don't let me make any mistakes, he gestured, trying to keep the movements of his fingers inconspicuous. Silk winked in reply. Once they were all seated and the food began to arrive, Garion began to relax. He found that all he had to do was follow Silk's lead, and the intricate niceties of formal dining no longer intimidated him. The talk around him was dignified and quite incomprehensible, but he reasoned that no one was likely to pay much attention to him, and that he was probably safe if he kept his mouth shut and his eyes on his plate. An elderly nobleman with beautifully curled silvery beard, however, leaned toward him. "You have traveled recently, I'm told," he said in a somewhat condescending tone. "How fares the kingdom, young man?" Garion looked hopelessly across the table at Silk. "What do I say?" he gestured with his fingers. "Tell him that the kingdom fares no better nor no worse than he might be anticipated under the present circumstances," Silk replied. Garion dutifully repeated that. "Ah," the old nobleman said. "Much as I had expected. You're a very observant boy for one so young. I enjoy talking with young people. Their views are so fresh." "Who is he?" Garion gestured. "The Earl of Selene," Silk replied. "He's a tiresome old bore, but be polite to him. Address him as my lord." "How did you find the roads?" the Earl inquired. "Somewhat in disrepair, my lord," Garion replied with Silk's prompting. "But that's normal for this time of year, isn't it?" "Indeed it is," the Earl said approvingly. "What a splendid boy you are." The strange three-way conversation continued, and Garion even began to enjoy himself as the comments fed to him by Silk seemed to amaze the old gentleman. At last the banquet was over, and the king rose from his seat at the head of the table. "And now, dear friends," he announced, "Queen Layla and I would like to visit privately with our noble guests, and so we pray you will excuse us." He offered his arm to Aunt Poll, Mr. Wolf offered his to the plump little queen, and the 4 of them walked toward the far door of the hall. The Earl of Selene smiled broadly at Garion, and then looked across the table. "I've enjoyed our conversation, Prince Kaldar," he said to Silk. "I may indeed be a tiresome old bore, as you say, but that can sometimes be an advantage, don't you think?" Silk laughed ruefully. I should have known that an old fox like you would be an adept at the secret language, my lord. A legacy from a misspent youth, the Earl laughed. Your pupil is... Pupil? Your pupil is most proficient, Prince Keldar, but his accent is strange. The weather was cold while he was learning, my lord, he said, and our fingers were a bit stiff. I'll correct the problem when we have leisure. The old nobleman seemed enormously pleased with himself at having outsmarted Silk. Splendid boy, he said, patting Garion's shoulder, and then he went off chuckling to himself. You knew he understood all along, Garion accused Silk. Of course, Silk said. Grasnian intelligence knows every adept at our secret speech. Sometimes it's useful to permit certain carefully selected messages to be intercepted. Don't ever underestimate the Earl of Selene, however. It's not impossible that he's at least as clever as I am, but look how much he enjoyed catching us. Can you ever do anything without being sly? Garion asked. His tone was a bit grumpy since he was convinced that somehow he had been the butt of the whole joke. Not unless I absolutely have to, my Garion, Silk laughed. People such as I continually practice deception, even when it's not necessary. Our lives sometimes depend on how cunning we are, and so we need to keep our wits sharp. It must be a lonely way to live, Garion observed rather shrewdly at the silent prompting of his inner voice. You never really trust anyone, do you? I suppose not, Silk said. It's a game we play, Garion. We're all very skilled at it. At least we are if we intend to live very long. We all know each other, since we're members of a very small profession. The rewards are great, but after a while we play our game only for the joy of defeating each other. You're right, though. It is lonely, and sometimes disgusting. But most of the time it's a great deal of fun. Count Nilden came up to them, and they bowed politely. His Majesty asks that you and the boy join him and the other friends in his private apartments, Prince Keldar, he said. If you'll be so good as to follow me. Of course, Silk said. Come along, Garion. The king's private apartments were much simpler than the ornate halls in the main palace. King Fulrak had removed his crown and state robes, and now looked much like any other Sendar in a rather ordinary clothes. He stood talking quietly with Barak. Queen Layla and Aunt Pal were seated on the couch deep in conversation, and Dernick was not far away, trying his best to look inconspicuous. Mr. Wolf stood alone near a window, his face like a thundercloud. Ah, Prince Keldar, the king said. I thought perhaps you and Garion had been waylaid. We were fencing with the Earl of Selene, your Majesty, Stoke said lightly. Figuratively speaking, of course. Be careful of him, the king cautioned. It's quite possible that he's too shrewd even for one of your talents. I have a great deal of respect for the old scoundrel, Soak laughed. King Fulrak glanced apprehensively at Mr. Wolf and then squared his shoulders and sighed. I'd suppose we'd better get this unpleasantness over with, he said. Layla, would you entertain our other guests while I give our grim-faced old friend there and the lady the opportunity to scold me? It's obvious that he's not going to be happy until they've said a few unkind things to me about some matters that weren't really my fault. Of course, dear, Queen Layla said. Try not to be too long, and please don't shout. The children have been put to bed, and they need their rest. Aunt Pal rose from the couch, and she and Mr. Wolf, whose expression hadn't changed, followed the king into an adjoining chamber. Well then, Queen Layla said pleasantly, what shall we talk about? I am instructed, your highness, to convey the regards of Queen Porin of Drasnia to you should the occasion arise, Soak said in a courtly manner. She asks leave of you to broach a correspondence on a matter of some delicacy. Why, of course, Queen Layla beamed. She's a dear child, far too pretty and sweet-natured for that fat old bandit Rodar. I hope he hasn't made her unhappy. No, your highness, Soak said. Amazing though it may seem, she loves my uncle to distraction, and he, of course, is delirious with joy over so young and beautiful a wife. It's positively sickening, the way they dote on each other. Someday, Prince Keldar, you will fall in love, the Queen said with a little smirk, and the 12 kingdoms will stand around and chortle over the fall of so notorious a bachelor. What is this matter Porin wishes to discuss with me? It's a question of fertility, your highness, Soak said with a delicate cough. She wants to present my uncle with an heir, and she needs to seek your advice in the business. The entire world stands in awe of your gifts in that particular area. Queen Layla blushed prettily and then laughed. I'll write to her at once, she promised. Garion by now had carefully worked his way to the door through which King Fulrak had taken Aunt Poll and Mr. Wolf. He began a meticulous examination of a tapestry on the wall to conceal the fact that he was trying to hear what was going on behind the closed door. It took him only a moment to begin to pick up familiar voices. Exactly what does all this foolishness mean, Fulrak? Mr. Wolf was saying. Please don't judge me too harshly, Ancient One, the king said placatingly. Some things have happened that you might not be aware of. You know that I'm aware of everything that happens, Wolf said. Did you know that we are defenseless if the accursed one awakens? That which held him in check has been stolen from off the throne of the Revan King. As a matter of fact, I was following the trail of the thief when your noble Captain Brendig interrupted me in my search. I'm sorry, Fulrak said, but you wouldn't have gone much farther anyway. All the kings of Eloria have been searching for you for 3 months now. Your likeness, drawn by the finest artists, is in the hand of every ambassador, agent, and official of the 5 kingdoms of the north. Actually, you've been followed since you left Dareen. Fulrak, I'm busy. Tell the Alorn kings to leave me alone. Why are they suddenly so interested in my movements? They want to have a council with you, the king said. The Alorns are preparing for war, and even my poor Sandaria is being quietly mobilized. If the accursed one arises now, we're all doomed. The power that's been stolen is very possibly be used to awaken him, and his first move will be to attack the west. You know that, Belgarath. And you also know that until the return of the Revan King, the west has no real defense. Garion blinked and started violently, and then tried to cover the sudden movement by bending to look at some of the finer detail on the tapestry. He told himself that he had heard wrong. The name King Fulrak had spoken could not have really been Belgarath. Belgarath was a fairy tale figure, a myth. Just tell the Alorn kings that I'm in pursuit of the thief, Mr. Wolf said. I don't have the time for councils just now. If they'll leave me alone, I should be able to catch up with him before he can do any mischief with the thing he's managed to steal. Don't tempt fate, Fulrak, Aunt Poll advised. Your interference is costing us time we can't afford to lose. Presently, I'll become vexed with you. The king's voice was firm as he answered. I know your power, Lady Polgara, he said, and Garion jumped again. I don't have any choice, however. I'm bound by my word to deliver you all up to Valalorn, to the kings of Eloria, and a king can't break his words to other kings. There was a long silence in the other room while Garion's mind raced through a dozen possibilities. You're not a bad man, Fulrak, Mr. Wolf said. Not perhaps as bright as I might wish, but a good man nonetheless. I won't raise my hands against you, nor will my daughter. Speak for yourself, old wolf, Aunt Poll said grimly. No, Polgara, he said. If we have to go to Valalorn, let's go with all possible speed. The sooner we explain things to the Alorns, the sooner they'll stop interfering. I think age is beginning to soften your brain, father, Aunt Poll said. We won't have the time for this excursion to Valalorn. Fulrak can explain that to the Alorn kings. It won't do any good, Lady Polgara, the king said rather ruefully. As your father so pointedly mentioned, I'm not considered very bright. The Alorn kings won't listen to me. If you leave now, they'll just send someone like Brendig to apprehend you again. Then that unfortunate man may suddenly find himself living out the remainder of his days as a toad, or possibly a radish, Aunt Poll said ominously. Enough of that, Poll, Mr. Wolf said. Is there a ship ready, Fulrak? It lies at the northern wharf, Belgarath, the king finally replied. A Cherrick vessel sent by King Onheg. Very well, Mr. Wolf said. Tomorrow, then, we'll go to Cherrick. It seems that I'm going to have to point out a few things to some thick-headed Alorns. Will you be going with us? I'm obliged to, Fulrak said. The council's to be general, and Sandaria is involved. You haven't heard the last of this, Fulrak, Aunt Poll said. Never mind, Poll, Mr. Wolf said. He's only doing what he thinks is right. We'll straighten it all out in Valalorn. Garion was trembling as he stepped away from the door. It was impossible. His skeptical Sandarian upbringing made him at first incapable of even considering such an absurdity. Reluctantly, however, he finally forced himself to look to the idea full in the face. What if Mr. Wolf really was Belgarath the Sorcerer, a man who had lived for over 7,000 years? And what if Aunt Pol was really his daughter, Polgara the Sorceress, who was only slightly younger? All the bits and pieces, the cryptic hints, the half-truths fell together. Silk had been right. She could not be his aunt. Garion's orphaning was complete now. He was adrift in the world, with no ties of blood or heritage to cling to. Desperately, he wanted to go home, back to Faldor's farm, where he could sink himself in unthinking obscurity, in a quiet place, where there were no sorcerers or strange searches, or anything that would even remind him of Aunt Pol and the cruel hoax she had made of his life. And that ends part number 1. Sandaria. Tomorrow, no, not tomorrow, Sunday night after this stream, we will continue with part 2, titled simply Cherik. But for tonight, guys, I'm going to catch some Z's because I got to work in... 7 hours. And hey guys, our second emoticon, the $9.99 subscriber emoticon rocks, has been approved. And apparently I just got like 44 emails. Hey Dr. Madnar, thanks for reminding me about story time. I enjoyed that. That was a good chapter and I liked the reveal. It's one of my favorite chapters in that book. One of my favorite moments anyway, when you finally... I remember the first time, because I read it when I was pretty young, that I realized, upon reading that Polgara and Mr. Wolf were Belgarath and Polgara. And it still kind of makes me laugh looking back to my 9 or 10-year-old self at how I didn't pick it up before that. Always leave one wanting more. I could keep reading, but I really do need to sleep. And get some rest so that I can hopefully either go to the fair with my wife or stream for you guys tomorrow. Seeing as we're actually finishing at 1 tonight, I'm going to kick it to Kilgore Trout for break time. So thanks guys for hanging out. My name is Joe and this has been Game Life Game. Plays games really badly tonight and then reads a pretty good book and a turning point in it. So I will catch you guys hopefully tomorrow. Some of you will be there for Jaws at 1 AM Eastern Daylight Time on Rabbit TV. I will post the link in Discord and also on the channel, probably in the channel feed around midnight tomorrow, so in about 23 hours once I have the room opened up. And then the movie Jaws will begin promptly at 1 AM. So hopefully some of you will join me. And if not, I'm going to watch it anyway, so it's all good. Like I said, I might be on tomorrow. Will depend on the weather and what the wife and I decide to do about this whole county fair thing. But I'll let you know via Discord, Twitter, and other means. So thanks again. This is Game Life Game, reminding you that life is what happens in between games. So go do whatever the hell you want to do. Enjoy your life. And I'll be here tomorrow, or the day after, and I'll see you next game. Night, guys. Thanks very much for hanging. We'll have a better day next stream. Sorry if I was a little off my game tonight. Alright, see ya.